Hello, everyone. So, if you can hear me, we've done the hardest part of tonight, which is making sure that my microphone is working. Thank you for coming. Currently, as I see it, we have 470 people joining us on a panel of four presenters and myself, Sam White. I'm a global fellow at the Centre for International Law, and a senior lecturer at UNSW Canberra. This is, I think, a very fun webinar. We're working off the premise that you understand where space is, right? So we're not going to be defining space, even though for Duncan, as a colleague of mine, I'm aware that it is a very contentious problem. Where does space start and where does space end? But we're looking at, I would say, the pointy end of space law today, which is how it interacts with international humanitarian law. Now, if I was an undergraduate student, you could probably argue we're here to talk about when things go bang in space, right? But we're much more sophisticated than that. So we're going to spend an hour and a half talking about it. It would be lacking an opportunity to do a shameless self-plug if we didn't talk about what brings everyone here today, which is a book that Duncan, myself, and another colleague, Professor Matthew Stubbs, have put together. And that was between UNSW Canberra and the National University of Singapore. It looks at the problem of dual use. Now, the last webinar, we talked about what dual use was, and the conclusion that some took away was it's a term that means nothing. But in IHL, it actually probably could mean something. If you tune in for the whole webinar, we can discuss that at the end. But we're talking today about dual use items in space, specifically satellites, but it can also expand. We're going to be talking about astronauts, whether or not astronauts are the envoys of mankind or if they are targetable. Duncan Blake from UNSW Canberra is going to start us off. Will then be followed by Clementine Rundle from the ICRC, Dr. Giacomo Bigo from Bristol, and then finishing off Lieutenant Colonel Chris Bailey from the United States Air Force Academy. Everyone is presenting in their personal capacities. I'm sure it'll be reinforced throughout the slides, but this is a purely academic discussion looking at academic points of law. Now, with that, I will hand over to Duncan to walk us through all things dual use in space. Thank you, Duncan.
Okay, well, bear with me a moment while I get my slides up, and I will just confirm now that
Perfect.
yes, you can see me and you can hear me. Fantastic. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Sam. In Stanley Kubrick's film 2001: A Space Odyssey, an ancestor of Homo sapiens picks up a bone and realizes it can dig and it can also kill. In that famous movie scene, the bone spins into the sky and becomes a satellite in orbit. Duality is not new. It has been a fact of human nature, arguably of any species capable of using tools, from then until our present state of apparent evolution. Duality is not even new to the space domain. The first human-made object deliberately launched into space was a Nazi V2 rocket, and Werner von Braun subsequently applied that technology to the US Civil Space Program. The chapter I wrote in the book that Sam mentioned with Stefan Musaki from Adelaide University on targeting and duality in the space domain was intended as a challenge to my own preconceptions, including my own preconception that the present focus on dual use, dual purpose, dual nature, or more generically, duality in the space domain, that focus is misapplied. Duality has been a fact in every domain. It will endure. The scope of things that may be put to hostile use is as broad as human ingenuity. The prospect of ending duality is as likely as the prospect of ending conflict. The two phenomena are linked. And although the outcomes of conflict are typically horrendous, we cannot condemn conflict absolutely, any more than we can condemn, for example, the Ukrainians for defending their homeland. Instead, we should seek to stabilise geopolitical affairs to mitigate the pressures towards conflict, and if conflict does happen, minimise the impact. The tagline of the ICRC as Global Champions of Humanitarianism, for example, is not that wars must stop, but that even wars have limits. I won't assume to speak for the ICRC beyond that tagline, not least because Clementine from the ICRC is the very next speaker. But I am confident that we would agree that there are already laws that apply to targeting and duality in the space domain, laws that apply across a spectrum from peaceful cooperation to armed conflict. Our preconception in the chapter that we wrote was that those laws are adequate. Researching and drafting the chapter was intended as a test of that preconception. It seems to be a popular narrative that duality breaks the legal frameworks, that because a satellite can be civil and military, state and commercial all at once, our rules are inadequate and we need something new. Our hypothesis is different. Adequacy isn't perfect clarity. Adequacy is fitness for purpose, whether the law still does its job of shaping responsible conduct. I won't have long to present our findings, but if you have the opportunity, read the chapter, critique it, and hold us to the evidence. I'm actually not going to spend too much time speaking about the law and its inadequacies or otherwise. I'll briefly discuss what we found in the chapter, but the first part of the chapter is where I'm going to spend most of my time in this presentation. I want to set the foundations for the speakers who will follow me by focusing on the military context of targeting in the space domain, what targeting actually means and how military decisions about targeting are made. I do that deliberately. I do that deliberately to provide you, the audience, with a foundation for a deeper understanding of many of the issues that Clementine, Giacomo, and Christopher will discuss. Quickly, the roadmap that I'm going to use. So 2 halves. First, the military context, which is my focus, then a fast run along the spectrum of hostility, short of war, the trigger for war, the conduct of war, and neutrality running all the way along the bottom. The law is tested differently at each point, and I'll suggest it largely holds for all of them. I need to say something about scope because it's complex and it's broad, and if we're not clear about what elements within that complex and broad scope we are discussing, then we're in danger of talking past each other. So when I say targeting and duality in the space domain, I mean 3 things at once, essentially. First, the thing or activities involved in targeting. It may itself be a target, such as SATCOM radomes on US bases in Bahrain and Kuwait struck by the Iranians, or it could be an integral element of the targeting process, such as recently the TEE-01B Chinese-built remote sensing satellite that was acquired by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard late in 2024. We should be clear about being the target versus doing the targeting. Secondly, the targeting involves the space domain. Again, we should be clear. Are we talking about effects from space, such as surveillance, navigation, and communication that enables the strikes on Earth, or effects through space, such as missiles that transit orbit, or effects to or in space, such as the counter-space weapons aimed at satellites themselves? Thirdly, and finally, the space targeting involves an element of duality. Once more, we should be clear about whether this duality is civil and military or state and commercial. And does that duality arise from its present purpose, future purpose, or simply its potential? Here are all 3 in a single object or in a single project in the picture that I have from the Future European Communication Ecosystem. And you can see that their plans are to use it across the spectrum of civil, commercial, and military. Now, the first idea that may be unfamiliar to a non-military audience is about capability. When the military talks about capability, it is referring to a whole system, including all of what are called, or at least in Australia, what we call the fundamental inputs to capability. The people, the training, the doctrine, the ground stations, the data links, the logistics, not just the satellite. Capability as a holistic system is quite typically spread across military, civil and commercial inputs and outputs. In terms of infrastructure density, the space domain is closer to the land domain than to the air or maritime domain. If you think back to the picture on the previous slide, for example. A communications satellite is like the telephone exchange within several hundred meters probably of where you are right now, wherever you are in the world. It's not a surprise that a telephone exchange routes military data as well as civil and commercial data. Why should it be a surprise that the communications satellite routes military data as well as civil and commercial data? Militaries decide about targets at three levels. Strategically, politics sets the objectives for any conflict, and national strategic end states and military strategic end states set out clearly what ought to be achieved, or at least that's the theory. I'm not sure that anybody is clear about the US end states for its war in Iran, for example, but the idea is that these end states ought to be clear. Assuming that there is clarity, the military draws on those concepts to derive its end states. The military conditions that need to be set, typically in reference to the enemy, in order to declare mission complete. Operationally, planners apply a military planning process to understand the intent of higher command, drawn from specified end states and objectives and the implicit constraints. Operational planners draw on intelligence to walk backwards from effect. What is the enemy's center of gravity, or the one thing which the success of the enemy revolves? Then in more detail, what capabilities does the center of gravity depend on? What does each capability require to be effective and sustained? And where are those requirements most vulnerable? The planners then sequence a series of missions to progressively degrade or destroy each vulnerability, leading to the enemy's collapse of the enemy's center of gravity. That's known as the defeat mechanism. The operational plan will include gathering intelligence on the effectiveness of all past missions, and every day those results are fed back into the planning process to revise the defeat mechanism. The operational plan generates missions for forces at the tactical level to execute. In Western forces, missions are relatively purposive. Achieve those outcomes at this time and place, but exactly how you do it is up to you. In the East, they are apparently more prescriptive. Western forces have a culture of mission command, which implies discretion in the means used to carry out a mission, but bounded discretion. The bounds of that discretion are drawn from documents known as rules of engagement, or ROE, and targeting directives and similar documents. They contain not just the legal constraints applicable to a conflict, but political, diplomatic, operational constraints too. They're initially drafted at the strategic level, then refined at the operational level. Tactically, forces execute inside those bounds and adapt to what's actually in front of them. Targeting is a process of narrowing, starting with everything you could physically strike, narrow to what is militarily effective or worth striking, narrow again to what is permissible in the sense of lawful, ethical, politically and diplomatically acceptable. And when those overlap is the authorized set, rules of engagement. And it keeps narrowing. Operational art sequences the strike, and tactical circumstances narrow the set again. How do planners find the best points in a capability system to strike. One common tool is Carver, 6 factors: criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. Take a concrete example from the chapter, the power lines feeding a satellite ground station. On paper, they look tempting, critical to the function, easy to reach, easy to identify, easy to damage. High, 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 high. But score the other two and it falls apart. Recuperability is high because of redundancy. The power is quickly restored. And so the lasting effect is low. Therefore, what seems like an obvious strike point turns out to be of poor value. Now, obviously, those factors are applied as applied to any particular target quickly becomes classified. So I'm not going to take it any further than that. Put that process in motion and you get the kill chain: find, fix, track, target, engage, assess, and then repeat. Space threads through every stage. ISR, position navigation and timing, and communications from space all help with every part of the kill chain, which sets up the whole second half of my presentation. A dual-use system that plays a role in any one of these phases risks itself being legally characterized as a military objective. So is the law adequate? Let's start below the threshold of war. Some reality first. Cooperation, competition, and conflict are all happening around us concurrently. Even while Russia and the US are cooperating on the International Space Station, US commercial space enterprises providing Ukraine with electronic intelligence about Russian activities, such as Hawkeye 360 on the slide, are concurrently shaping, signaling, and degrading Russian capabilities for broader US national purposes. The tools may not be violent and kinetic, so we don't tend to call them weapons, and yet the language of targeting still applies. Decide who and what to shape, signal, and degrade, and select the time, place, and means to do so. None of that is war, but it is coercive targeting, and often civilians bear the impact. The laws here are the principles of state responsibility plus space law. The supervision and due regard duties in the Outer Space Treaty, reparations for internationally wrongful acts, the possibility of countermeasures, etc. Our verdict was that the relevant law exists and can be readily applied to a set of facts, but establishing the facts, attributing actions to actors, and applying enforcement actions with some degree of nuance is what's difficult. Now, we also looked at the trigger for war, jus ad bellum, at time, so I'm going to just give you an overall verdict at the end. We also looked at law of armed conflict, and we also looked at neutrality. And I'll just say that neutrality is the most troubling. Skipping forward, in short, our verdict is that law is mostly adequate. Interpret with integrity, develop capabilities for more factual certainty, and share the outcomes. That's what will best manage the enduring paradigms of concurrent cooperation, competition, and conflict, and of duality in any domain, including the space domain. I'm happy to expand on the matters that I skipped over at the end in any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan. And we will come back to that point about neutrality, I think, at the end. We'll have time as well. It's a very important point. I'll hand now to Clementine to talk about the ICRC perspective. And she is here appearing as the regional delegate, I think, based in Bangkok still.
Yes, that's right. Hi, Sam.
Hi. The stage is yours.
Great. And you'll interrupt me if the slides are not complying, but they should be
We
up.
can see the slides, and I'll interrupt you at 14 minutes.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here. As Sam said, I'm the regional legal advisor for the ICRC based in Bangkok, but covering quite a few countries in the region. It's a pleasure to be here. Contrary to Sam's introduction, if you are here for IHL 101, this is for you. Good on you for joining the call. Hope you take something away. But I'm just going to sort of do a bit of a recap or a refresher for IHL rules that I think Giacomo and Chris are going to build on with their technical expertise as well. Before we get into the law, let me just underscore what's at stake from our perspective. So the ICRC as a humanitarian organisation has long been concerned with the human cost, potential human cost of military operations in or in relation to outer space. And Duncan explained very well, we're probably talking about not just operations in space, but potentially operations against ground components or indeed the link in between those. As I think we're familiar, the technology enabled by space systems plays an indispensable role in most aspects of our lives today. So essential civilian services like water, electricity, sanitation, waste management, healthcare, food production, etc., increasingly depend on space-based technologies. Navigation, communications, remote sensing satellites are becoming indispensable to the functioning of our essential services. If you take agriculture as an example, you've got satellite data that enables precision farming, crop monitoring, and food control of food supply chain logistics. You've got GPS that guides automated harvesters, Earth observation satellites that track soil moisture, predict droughts, and optimize irrigation. So disrupting these systems can devastate food security, and particularly in vulnerable regions. To add, humanitarian organisations like the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Cross or Red Crescent national societies rely on satellite services to respond to the needs of people affected by armed conflict and other emergencies. So particularly weather communication, navigation, and Earth observation or imaging satellites contribute to every phase of humanitarian action, from needs assessments, locating affected populations, maintaining contact with humanitarian teams, planning and delivering relief, and also supporting recovery and reconstruction. If we take just the ICRC as an example, about 10 to 15% of our structures and personnel rely solely on satellite communication. And we've got about 2,600 vehicles that have satellite tracking equipment installed. So without these satellite services, reaching affected populations and responding to their needs can become extremely difficult or even impossible. So when we look at how space systems have become integral to modern military operations and the increasing likelihood that they'll be targeted, we're concerned about the potential wide-reaching implications of disruption to essential civilian services on Earth, including those humanitarian relief and emergency response functions. So I'm just going to focus on the basic IHL rules regulating the conduct of hostilities and how they can apply to operations in outer space or with effects extending to outer space. The three key principles with which I hope you're familiar are distinction, proportionality, and precautions. I'm going to start unusually with precautions because this informs the potential practical solutions to some of the challenges we see relating to space operations. So the baseline understanding is that constant care needs to be taken by parties to spare the civilian population and civilian objects in the conduct of their military operations. And all feasible precautions need to be taken to avoid or at least minimise incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. More specifically, in attack, parties need to do everything feasible to verify that targets are military objectives and to assess proportionality. And they also need to choose the means and methods of attack that represent the least anticipated civilian harm. And similarly, where there's a choice between military objectives that offer the same or a similar military advantage, they need to take the one that is expected to cause the least civilian harm. In defence, parties also need to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians and civilian objects from the effects of attack, including to remove civilian objects from the vicinity of military objectives. And these precautions are obligations that states should be taking already in peacetime. So if we move into distinction, you'll all be familiar with the principle that parties must always distinguish between civilian objects and military objectives and must only direct their attacks against military objectives. The prohibition of indiscriminate attacks also requires parties to target a specific military objective and only to use means and methods of warfare that are capable of doing that. In the last session, the last webinar with the foundations, there was discussion about that breadth of the notion of dual use. What does it actually mean? Well, it's not a term of art and it doesn't appear in international humanitarian law. More precisely, IHL imposes a dichotomy. It's either a military objective or it's a civilian object. So to be a military objective, it's got to meet a two-limb definition where the object is making an effective contribution to military action and its destruction, capture or neutralization offers a definite military advantage in the circumstances ruling at the time. So if it doesn't meet that two-pronged test, it's a civilian object that's protected from attack. So when we talk about dual use, it can be tempting to skip ahead and just assume that something that has potentially a military purpose or function is a military objective, but it really shouldn't be taken for granted. Perhaps more relevantly in relation to cyber, Duncan was talking about redundancies. So if a component that's being used for military purposes is subject to numerous redundancies. So if a military has ready alternatives that they can turn to, then really do you have a military advantage in targeting or destroying that military objective? So it's really a question of what the alternatives are as well and what the advantage is. Ownership isn't determinative. So the fact that it's civilian ownership or commercial ownership doesn't necessarily mean that it's a civilian object. On the other side of the coin, the military use of a single component or function doesn't automatically mean that each connected component of a space system becomes a military objective. So it's a determination that needs to be made carefully in respect of each object or component in light of its use at the relevant time. When we think about potential solutions to the challenges of dual use space objects, the first issue is, of course, that simultaneous military and civilian use of space systems places civilian activities and services at a heightened risk. So that's something that should be factored in when developing military space capabilities and certainly when then using them during an armed conflict. One recommendation on our side is that to avoid or minimize that incidental civilian harm, whenever feasible, states should physically or technically separate or segment space systems for use for military purposes from those used for civilian purposes. And I think that's an interesting point to discuss. That would be particularly interesting, or sorry, particularly important for those systems that are serving essential civilian services, humanitarian operations, medical services, and objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. For example, like agriculture, as I was talking about. The second key issue there is one that was raised in the last webinar, is that challenge of ascertaining how a particular component is being used or even verifying that. So the risk there is that even if it's actually not being used for military purposes, that lack of visibility might mean that it's perceived as having a military purpose and therefore being targeted. So it's a practical risk. So thinking about passive precautions against the effects of attack, how can states make it easier to identify those components that are not military objectives, i.e. that are protected from attack? And there we'd recommend that states look at ways to identify, register, mark, and announce these space systems or components within their jurisdiction or control that should be spared from the effects of military space operations. Moving into proportionality. So even if you've got a space object or another component that qualifies as a military objective according to that two-pronged definition, any attack against that objective remains subject to the principles of proportionality as well as precautions, which I've talked about, as well as other rules of international law. So that requires an assessment of all the foreseeable direct and indirect incidental harm that will flow to civilians and civilian objects, both in outer space and on Earth. And that assessment needs to include the potential consequences of impairing the civilian functions of a dual-use system, including that interruption of essential services and humanitarian operations. I would add, it would also be relevant to think about the potential cumulative impact in a conflict setting. So, for example, if you've got civilian infrastructure that's already disrupted or restricted or otherwise degraded, then humanitarian actors are going to be more dependent on those satellite services that you're then thinking about targeting. An example from the Pacific outside of the context of armed conflict, if you remember, I'm going to try and pronounce it, the Hunga Tonga Hunga Hapai volcano and tsunami back in 2022 that cut the only international data cable to Tonga, which then meant that the government, as well as the Tongan Red Cross, were entirely dependent on satellite services to coordinate the humanitarian response. Incidental harm will depend on a number of factors, including the type of civilian services that are affected, the degree of reliance that they have on that satellite component, the specific component that's being targeted, and the means or methods used to do so. And I think Giacomo and Chris are going to speak to some of the differentiations there. So if you think about, for example, radio frequency jamming or cyber operations might offer the possibility of having only a temporary impact, while kinetic attacks that damage or destroy satellites might have long-term knock-on effects on space systems. So you just got to kind of weigh up what that potential impact is, and again, choose the one that represents the least civilian harm. A few overarching recommendations flowing from all of that are that if you consider the significant risk of civilian harm, as well as the existing IHL general rules and specific protections, the ICRC calls on states to refrain from conducting activities that are going to disable space systems that are necessary for essential civilian services and those specifically protected people and objects. We didn't quite touch on it, but another one is to refrain from developing, testing, or using kinetic counter space capabilities or conducting other harmful space operations that are designed or expected to cause space debris because of that potential knock-on effect. And then finally, we do continue to call for cooperation amongst states and other relevant actors to try and increase the resilience of satellite services for humanitarian relief and emergency response. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Clem. We'll leave your slides up just so people can scan those QR codes very quickly if you want, and really brings us into the 21st century, I would suggest, by having those QR codes. So good work. Thank you. Well, in the meantime, I'll introduce a visiting fellow to CIL from last year, Currently, as I understand from him, sweltering in 35 degrees at 8 a.m. in Europe. Perhaps he can even tell us exactly where he is. But Giacomo and I have worked together extensively, I would say, over the last 18 months on all things emerging technology and IHL. He has a very practical understanding, I would argue, of all things IHL. So we'll hand over to him now. And I suspect that you're not at Bristol.
No, I mean, well, I'm still working at Bristol. I'm in Sardinia at the moment, so southern Italy.
Well, it's definitely warmer than Canberra in winter. So we'll hand over to you to talk all things IHL, mate.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the kind introduction and for organizing this seminar. I'm very happy to be here and excited to present on my topic. Let me share my slides right now. My topic explores the issue of duality from the perspective of cyber operations. It looks at the regulation of cyber operations against space systems under IHL, focusing specifically as a case study on the hacking of the KSAT satellite. So in this four-part presentation, I will start with a brief factual background of what the KSAT space system is and the hack that disabled it. And then I'm going to look into the practical differences of two different interpretations as to how international humanitarian law should regulate the operation, looking at specifically what are the main differences. And then I will conclude by examining a few key takeaways. So in terms of the factual background, the KSAT satellite is part of a space system owned by the company Viasat, which provides broadband connectivity in the Middle East and Europe, including Ukraine. And in 2022, it had been used by the armed forces of Ukraine for the purposes of communications and data relay. In the night between the 21st and 22nd of February 2022, just as Russia was about to launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the KSAT satellite suffered a temporary interruption of broadband service, which resulted in a huge connectivity loss for the armed forces of Ukraine. The operation also had some unintended consequence spillover ripple effects in that more than 30,000 civilian modems across Europe were rendered inoperative because their flash data was erased by the operation, and about 6,000 wind turbines located in Germany, owned by the energy company Enercon, were also affected. In terms of the legal qualification of the operation, as a minimum, we know that it is governed by international humanitarian law, as it took place during the international armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine that had been ongoing since 2014, as soon as Russia occupied Crimea. And by the way, the attack has been allegedly attributed to the Russian government, was denied any involvement, of course. The key question here in terms of the legal qualification of the operation is whether the hack amounts to an attack under Article 49 of the first additional protocol, or rather as a military operation. These distinctions matter in terms of the specific rules that are applicable. Attacks, in fact, are limited by all of the rules on the conduct of hostilities. So distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack, including the more general duty to take constant care, whereas military operations are only limited by the duty of constant care and by the principle of distinction. There are also differences in terms of, hypothetically speaking, international criminal responsibility, because intentionally directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects is a war crime. We do not have the same equivalent with regards to military operations. So the crux of the matter really revolves around what is an attack as far as cyber operations are concerned. Starting from the provision, Article 49 of Additional Protocol 1, we know that attacks are defined as acts of violence against the adversary, whether in offense or defense. And there is broad agreement that the focus of the provision is not about the means used, but the expected effects of an act that should consist in physical violence. The Tallinn Manual, as early as 2013, has adhered to this approach, defining a cyber operation as an attack when it is reasonably expected to result in physical violence in the form of death or injury to individuals or damage or destruction to objects. So in the context of space systems, any cyber operation that directly causes the destruction of a satellite, for instance, would be an attack because it caused destruction of objects. Or cyber operations against the GPS systems, who is expected to cause downstream effects on Earth amounting to death or injury to individuals, would also be considered as an attack. That, however, leaves open a number of questions, including whether or not within the notion of violence, we should also include loss of functionality and disruption or deletion of satellite data, for example. With regard to loss of functionality, the Tallinn Manual held that loss of functionality equals physical violence only if loss of functionality is permanent. And therefore, restoration of functionality would require the replacement of physical components. On the other hand, it excludes destruction of digital data, since data, according to the Tallinn Manual, falls outside the ordinary meaning of the term object under international humanitarian law. Because objects are something that are both visible and tangible, the argument goes, which data are not. The Tallinn Manual's view, a more restrictive approach, has been shared to varying degrees of nuance by several states, including Australia, Canada, Denmark, Israel, I would say most notably, and the United Kingdom. This is one restrictive approach to how to qualify the notion of attack in the context of cyber operations. A more expansive approach has been advanced since at least, I would say, 2019 by the ICRC. According to the ICRC, a cyber operation is an attack when it's designed to disrupt the functionality of a computer network, reversibly or not, temporarily or permanently. Also, according to the ICRC, we have a broader interpretation of the notion of object, which includes essential civilian data. So cyber operation that deletes, destroys, manipulates essential civilian data, who are considered objects, will also be considered as an attack. And I would say that this approach, this more expansive approach, has been shared by several states, an increasingly large number of states, to the point where we can see that it's right now the majoritarian view. Some of these states that followed suit are France and Germany, though, again, these states have expressed their views in their national positions on the application of international law to cyberspace with varying degrees of nuance. Now, let's apply these two different interpretations in the context of the KSAT hack. Under the restrictive approach, the operation does not qualify as an attack. It was not reasonably expected to result in physical violence, but merely temporary loss of functionality and data deletion, as it deleted the data of more than 30,000 civilian modems. The case attack would be more likely qualified as a military operation. And in this regard, the commentary by the ICRC to Additional Protocol 1 defines them as movements, maneuvers, and other activities whatsoever carried out by the armed forces with a view to combat. So we can clearly adapt and analogize this interpretation of the notion of military operations to cyber operations. Conversely, under the expansive approach, since the operation caused even temporary disruption of functionality, deleted data, the operation would be qualified as an attack. And as we will see, the difference in terms of application of IHL rules will be meaningful. As a minimum, however, regardless of the interpretation, the case attack would be limited by the principle of distinction. Foundational principle of IHL, which requires the parties to the conflict to distinguish at all times between civilians and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives, and shall direct their operations only against military objectives. So the focus of the provision here is on operations, which include both the broader category of military operations as well as the more restrictive subcategory of attacks. What does it mean? Well, it means that we will have to define whether or not, or determine whether or not the KSAT space system qualifies as a military objective. In this regard, only those parts of the KSAT system, specifically the ground and link segments that were being used by the armed forces of Ukraine, would qualify as a military objective, provided that through their use, they were making an effective contribution to military action, and their neutralization would have offered to the Russian armed forces, in the circumstances ruling at the time, a definite military advantage. But I would say that was the case for the KSAT satellite, which illustrates the consequences here of the duality issue in space. From then on, the two different interpretations diverge in terms of applicable rules. In fact, under the more restrictive interpretation, the KSAT hack is a military operation that is merely limited by the duty of constant care. The duty of constant care is a very important but under-discussed principle that you can find within the general rules on precautions, and can be defined as an obligation of conduct to be exercised with due diligence that requires military commanders to maintain at all times situational awareness, to take action to mitigate any adverse effect resulting from military operations which may impact the civilian population and civilian objects, including adverse effects of a non-physical nature. However, the duty of constant care does not impose requirements which are as strict as those mandated by the principle of proportionality and by the rules on precaution applicable to attacks, as we will see right now, applying the expansive interpretation to the KSAT hack. As I said, under the expansive interpretation, the operation qualifies as an attack, and it's subject to the rules on precaution in attack. So the obligation to verify that the target is a military objective, the obligation of doing everything feasible to avoid or minimize incidental civilian harm, the obligation to refrain from launching an attack which may be expected to result in incidental civilian harm, and so on. I will focus, given the time constraints, specifically here on the principle of proportionality. Because the principle of proportionality prohibits, as a species of indiscriminate attacks, those which may be expected to cause incidental civilian harm excessive to the concrete and military advantage anticipated. Incidental civilian harm is defined as damage or destruction to civilian objects. So the question is, are non-violent effects such as loss of functionality, data deletions included? This is another under-discussed issue. The Tallinn Manual, for instance, considered that certain non-violent effects, such as inconvenience, irritation, stress, or fear, do not qualify as incidental civilian harm, but remain silent on other types of effect that sits a little bit higher on the spectrum of non-violent effects, such as the economic losses, which may be expected to result from loss of functionality or even deletion of civilian satellite data. In this regard, the Law of War Manual of the United States excludes economic harm from the meaning of incidental civilian harm because it's too causally removed from an operation, any operation, not just a cyber operation, to be considered. Whereas the ICRC, on an expert meeting on the meaning of the principle of proportionality, has considered that it depends. Economic harm may be included within the meaning of incidental harm only if it's causally connected to the attack and only if it's reasonably foreseeable by the military commander. So the application of the principle of proportionality from this expansive approach is not as easy as it seems, especially because even if we can assume that states who have adopted such an expansive approach could resort to a purposive interpretation of the proportionality rule and include non-violent effects within the meaning of incidental civilian harm, then there's been no debate whatsoever as to when these non-violent effects should be considered as excessive to the direct and concrete military advantage anticipated by the military commander. This, in fact, is an open question. So let me conclude with a few key takeaways. I believe that here the problem of duality, as illustrated by the KSAT satellite, manifests itself in the fact that dual-use space assets can become legitimate targets for military operations, including cyber operations, and that creates a persistent uncertainty in relation to which rules of international humanitarian law may apply. The case attack also is a relatively easy case study. What about cyber operations that disrupt the functionality of GNSS systems like GPS, early warning, remote sensing satellites, satellites providing essential civilian services? To what extent the reverberating effect should be taken into account, not for determining the application of the proportionality rule, but for qualifying these operations as attacks or military operations? A tempting solution would be that of following Article 58 of Additional Protocol 1 to the letter. But I don't think that the economy of space would allow that, unfortunately. And the case in point would be the increased use of commercial satellites such as Starlink for military purposes, or even, for example, Mizar Vision. I think that the best solution would be expanding the definition of attack, lowering the threshold of violence to include temporary loss of functionality and data disruption, and keep fostering a common understanding among states in the appropriate fora, such as now the upcoming global mechanism on the application of international law to cyberspace. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I mean, I think this flow between the legal foundations to the practicality of the hacking kind of shows how when we are talking about the issues of dual use in space, it's not always blowing up satellites, mainly because also the cost, as you say, and the economic drivers that fall behind this. We'll turn now to Lieutenant Colonel Chris Bailey from the United States Air Force, who's an assistant professor at the Air Force Academy, and perhaps he can talk to us about blowing things up, which tends to be what the US Air Force are good at, but he might surprise us and also talk all things economy. Chris, over to you.
No, I appreciate it. Give me 1 second so I can share slides.
And Giacomo's still sharing slides. Perfect.
All right. Can you all see my slides?
Sounds great.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. So first off, I just wanted to say thank you, and I'm honored to be a part of this outstanding panel looking at duality in space. My focus today, just in the interest of time, I'll try and keep my opening comments pretty brief, but we've talked a lot today about space systems, about the avenues of attack, the avenues of military operations. But when I was thinking of what to highlight and discuss today, I kept coming back to was effectively the pathway for many of those attacks, and effectively the electromagnetic spectrum. And so really what I have found over my research and just in discussing a lot of these issues is just the oftentimes misunderstanding about what the electromagnetic spectrum is, the avenues attack, and some of the risks and players that operate in that space. Before I get too far, obviously the obligatory government disclaimer. So the topics views I'm going to be covering today are my own and don't necessarily reflect the position of the U.S. Air Force or the United States government. And so really, I want to start with sort of as a scene setter, what do we mean when we say spectrum or spectrum management? We're then going to look at the players and what I view as sort of the key risks, and really a scope and severity of risk that has increased, I'd say, in the past 2 to 3 years in particular, with the advent of small unmanned aerial systems, or UAS, or drones, as a lot of people like to refer to them, and where that has really highlighted, right, what we think of as not necessarily a space capability, but a type of means and method of warfare that is incredibly reliant on space infrastructure. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Then I'm going to look at really when we talk about electromagnetic spectrum, obviously there's the body of IHL law, but what I really focus on as sort of a foundation, 1967 Outer Space Treaties, Article 9, concept of harmful interference, and then the 1992 International Telecommunication Union Constitution, which provides a little bit more in-depth analysis of what is harmful interference within the spectrum context. And then we'll talk a little bit about how, as has been highlighted in the past two presentations, the definition of attack doesn't necessarily address activities targeting spectrum itself. And then, I've highlighted a lot of problems, a lot of concerns, but I feel like I owe at least a little bit on terms of where can we move forward and what might be a few practical solutions in the short term and medium term. And so with that, when we talk about the risk portfolio or the risk profile, and I talked about that kind of 2 to 3 years, I think the conflict in Ukraine has really highlighted the rapid expansion of the use of small first-person view drones and their reliance on GPS. And so there's a range of different articles. I've highlighted one here, but Wired Magazine had an outstanding article back in December highlighting just the scope of GPS attack. And when we say GPS attack, that's really, it was the militaries both in the conflict zone, but also outside the conflict zone, utilizing a range of different GPS jamming or signal jamming technologies. In military context, what we tend to think of as electronic warfare, a range of capabilities to try and thwart the threat of small UAS. Over the past year, significant reports from airlines, from different companies, from users, right? Myself, using phones, right? Identifying a degraded GPS signal, degraded communications networks, largely oftentimes attributed to this mix of GPS jamming. And so whenever I'm working with my students and we sort of start discussing this concept of electromagnetic, the spectrum, electromagnetic spectrum, I always like to start with this chart. And so this is a tool that's published by NASA in the United States. And I find it really effective because we like to think of spectrum as this finite resource. But I like this tool in this graph because it effectively shows, right, when we think about what we can see, right, that physical connectivity, the physical systems, right, we're operating in the visible light spectrum, right, what we can see with our own eyes. But if you look to the left of the photograph, right, you see a range of the spectrum that is invisible to our eyes, but is really essential to modern day telecommunications. And so I'll just briefly highlight, right, when we think of Wi-Fi, when we think of cellular service, telephone service, it's the use of those radio waves, and there's increasing capabilities to utilize microwaves or infrared as a means of communication between satellites, between systems, both on Earth, in orbit, in that from and to space area. And this is really effectively the highway, right, that those communications flow. Your GPS receiver is only as effective as the quality of the signal that it's receiving from those on-orbit satellites. And so I like this graph again just because it highlights that the wide scope. And there's a concept, it's oftentimes used in the cyber context, but I think it's just as applicable here, called convergence. And so there are famous photos from New York City in the 1910s, 1920s, where you'd walk down a street and you would see 30, 40, 100 different telephone lines, and each one would be a different company in this massive, just physical space where those communication nodes would flow. That has largely been attributed now and been passed to the electromagnetic spectrum. And so this concept of convergence. So you'll receive your GPS signal, your Instagram updates, your emails, as well as your telephone calls and watching television, all on effectively that same band of spectrum. And that term convergence is really useful because it highlights how I'd say the industry of telecommunications has shifted, and the military's connection, role, and engagement has as well. And that really takes me to when we talk about spectrum management, who are the key players? And so really as a foundational note, it is the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. Created at the turn of the 20th century, and it was really similar to today, a period of instability, of concern, of risk, public safety, but it was all designed and initially based off of the radio. A number of states got together and found that there was a significant risk for miscommunication, jamming, lost signals, and not even necessarily for nefarious reasons, but just as the technology associated with the radio was developing, that there needed to be rules of the road so that we could utilize this new technology to its most effective mechanism. That was really the creation of the ITU. As the space age kicked off in the 50s and 60s, the ITU started to take a role in that spectrum management for satellite systems as well. And as part of that infrastructure, that international regulation, national spectrum regulators have a key role as well. For example, in the United States, we have what's known as the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and their sole job is to assess who gets what bands of spectrum, right, to avoid interference, to avoid jamming, to avoid some of those miscues. And so their chief responsibility is to help provide what spectrum is provided to what client or what customer. Understanding that a certain amount of spectrum will be reserved for government use, for military use. And that's really where you see there is also a role for national space agencies and militaries as well, depending on the state and how their space programs are set up, where if a private company wants to have a license for a launch vehicle or for a satellite, a necessary component of that license will be an allocation of spectrum. And so with that allocation of spectrum, they're able to communicate with ground stations, and they're able to ensure they're in compliance with those license requirements and the requirements of the Outer Space Treaty. And so within that context, we like to think of space agencies as, or potentially military space programs as controlling that space enterprise. But really, it goes back to that spectrum component. That is that invisible link that allows these systems to operate successfully. In that concept, you see this increasing role for space companies, not only as a spectrum user, right, for the ability for them to manage and control their own satellites, but as a service provider. I think the clearest example, right, that is often highlighted is SpaceX with the Starlink system. A range of countries, a range of militaries, a range of nonprofits, civilian groups rely on that internet provided through the Starlink system. And so that is where, right, you and I, as telecommunications users, are a user of spectrum as well. And so within this kind of complex, both international, domestic, civil, military, and personal kind of environment, we have this increasing risk to easy access and easy management of spectrum. And when we talk risks, I think the biggest one, right, we have our telecommunications links. We don't utilize cell phone lines in the same way we might have before, and we rely much on that spectrum. And so that increasing reliance on a spectrum-based service. And again, that proliferation of spectrum-enabled threats. Generally, drones would not be as effective or as much of a risk if it wasn't for their use of GPS signals to help identify location, timing, targeting. And increasingly, those drones are relying on that civilian infrastructure for those signals and timing for their military operations. In addition, you're also seeing an expanding use of military use of commercial spectrum-based services. So I think historically, right, we think of states having military systems very clear delineation between government and military systems, and increasingly, militaries are utilizing the same services, the same telecommunications backbone that civilians are. And so when we talk about duality, we're seeing that increasing combination, both from a defensive perspective and as an offensive perspective. And then finally, very similar to the cyber context, I think one of the things we struggle with when we look at spectrum and jamming or spoofing, so effectively, making a ship look like it's in a different location based off of modifying signals. It's really difficult to identify actors in that context just by the nature of the medium and also the intent. Solar or space weather, solar storms can have a jamming impact on telecommunications. There's a range of different non-nefarious events that can occur that all create a complexity when trying to identify what's occurring in the environment, right? And what is actually causing this particular degradation of signal or otherwise. So from a legal perspective, right? So we talk about military operations, and obviously as a practitioner of IHL, international humanitarian law in general, we always think of those kind of those initial sources in conflict. But as Duncan highlighted in his opening comments, a range of these activities, a range of these operations will occur below that threshold of conflict. And so I always start with the Outer Space Treaty Article 9, because that really sets the bedrock when it comes to harmful interference towards space-based systems. But as you'll see in the definition, harmful interference is actually never defined. And when we talk harmful interference in the space context, we oftentimes think of on-orbit activities, right? So placements of satellites. What orbits are satellites operating in? Proximity operations, right? So what is the understanding of if a satellite system flies close to another satellite system? We tend to think less about that jamming component, but it is a key component, right? It is still can constitute harmful interference and is broadly accepted by states that jamming could constitute interference as well. Without a definition of harmful interference, I oftentimes look to the ITU itself, because it actually does define harmful interference. Obviously not for all space-based systems, but when it comes to that spectrum use. And it defines interference that endangers the functioning of radio navigation service or of other safety services, or seriously degrades, obstructs, or repeatedly interrupts. Putting my cyber hat on, I'm like, I like that definition, right? We heard in the last presentation where that tension between the restricted approach to attack is only looking at permanent loss of functionality versus the more expansive approach that looks at all functioning. This would seem to fit in that more expansive approach, where it's any interference that can endanger functioning of any sort, right? Or that serious degradation, repeated process. We then shift to Article 45 of the ITU Constitution, and it establishes, right, that when it comes to harmful interference, state parties are obligated to ensure that their activities do not harmfully interfere. But there's an important caveat, and that comes in Article 48. So member states retain their full freedom with regard to any military radio installations, and generally interpreted to be those military uses of spectrum. And so effectively, those prior definitions do not apply in the same context. You'll see, though, that second sentence, military installations must, as far as possible, observe the measures to be taken to prevent harmful interference. And so when I'm thinking of how does that work in that concept of military operations, I think of that due care requirement, in that it is a lesser standard than, say, some of the prohibitions on attack. And this is open for debate, but there's still a clear direction for militaries that they must take due care when they're conducting those military radio activities, use of spectrum that could cause harmful interference. And finally, when we look to the additional protocol definition for Article 49 for attacks, we see, right, it's that focus on violence, which isn't quite a great fit for spectrum. And so just in what I would highlight is I think the risks that are present under the Outer Space Treaty and the ITU assumptions, they assume that there's clear bifurcation between military and civilian use of spectrum, which we're seeing decreasing. We're seeing that states control and manage spectrum allocation across the board. That's not always the case. We're seeing increasingly where companies will sell and license spectrum to each other. And then finally, we assume that spectrum is a finite resource. I think moving forward, there are three key components that can help address some of these spectrum-based threats. First, states defining spectrum as critical infrastructure, identifying areas of spectrum that will be utilized for those core civilian, think emergency services, think certain economic functions, right? And designating that as those areas of spectrum could not be used for, say, GPS or personalized GPS. And other examples. The second, scoping the extent private space enterprise is a service provider. And so understanding if companies are building into their contracts, scoping how their spectrum will be used in what context. And then finally, risk-centric system design and fielding. Norway is doing some fascinating work right now on building survivability, reliability, and anti-jamming capabilities as a matter of insurance. And requiring ships, aircraft, companies that field these capabilities for their systems to build in anti-jamming capabilities, right, to protect some of that. And they're using insurance mechanisms to help enforce that. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities there. But one, I think as a threshold is recognizing the increasing risk to spectrum and how we manage that both with our current legal structure and what are practical steps to move forward. And with that, I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Something that just immediately comes to me is, the power of historical analogies. And I would invite the other panelists, if they can turn their cameras on, please, as we enter the question stage. I mean, for those that know me, know that I enjoy history, and I think that there are many lessons that can be solved by history. And so I would ask, one of the questions we've had in the Q&A is it's a question about the law of naval warfare and its applicability to space. And that obviously, to put that link together, it's a historical question, right? In the first instance, what legal analogy should we be using? But I'm also interested as well when we talk about the service providers. Like, do we think here that we're at a new stage of international law where we are relying on these mega corporate gatekeepers, right? Or is this not a particularly new problem? So I'd ask the panel to think on that while Duncan answers the question in the Q&A. And then Duncan, if you also wanted to talk about neutrality after that, the floor is yours.
Sure. So there was a question in the Q&A, a written question about the interaction of the law of naval warfare and Additional Protocol 1. Noting that potentially both of them have application in the space domain, but noting that there are domain-specific elements of both of those. I mean, law of naval warfare, obviously it's in the title. Additional Protocol 1 was written around land warfare, and the way that it's written has some limitations, arguably. That's something that's acknowledged in the Woomera Manual. So the question that was asked was...
Sorry, Duncan, you might want to expand on what the Woomera Manual is.
So the Woomera Manual was an international project over a number of years to seek to clarify the application of spectrum of laws applicable to military activities in outer space. And when I say the spectrum, from peace to outright hostility. So not just laws of armed conflict, but use ad bellum as well, and laws applicable in circumstances of relative peace, and even if they involve a level of coercion. So like the Tallinn Manual, like the San Remo Manual, like the Harvard Manual, the format is a short statement of a rule that is somewhat a paraphrasing of rules that we're familiar with from law of armed conflict, for example, but adapted to the space domain. followed by several pages of commentary. So that's what I'm referring to when I refer to the Woomera Manual. It was put together by a group of experts meeting over 6 or 7 years. It was something that I was involved in when far longer. It was like 14 years of my life, as it turns out, but a very worthwhile project. But the question about what do you do when there are two areas of law applicable to the same set of facts, and the temptation is to jump immediately to what you might call the principles of priority. If there might be some non-lawyers who are in the audience. We use Latin terms, lex specialis, the more specific rule applies, lex superior, where more important rules apply. That's not a very prevalent situation, and lex prior and lex posterior, so circumstances where a earlier or a later rule apply. But although it'd be tempting to jump to those, you said, Sam, you liked a little bit of a historical approach to these. Lex specialis was first noted, maybe not first, but it was noted as early as the middle of the 17th century by Hugo Grotius, who is often thought of as the father of international law in some ways. And to paraphrase the way he put it is, you look at the rule that most nearly approaches the situation at hand, and then it only applies to the extent of there's some inconsistency. One of the things to take from that, it's never about taking the approach that a whole area of law prevails over a whole area of other law. It's not the case that space law prevails over other areas of law in respect of anything that happens in space. You look at it rule by rule is the first thing. The second thing that I'd say about it is those principles of priority are not the place to start. The place to start is scope. So first of all, what is the scope of the two rules? And when that's particularly applicable when you're thinking about potentially domain-specific rules. So if you're taking something from the late law of naval warfare, does it even apply to the situation that you're talking about? Looking very carefully at the scope of each rule, and only proceeding if they really do overlap in terms of scope. And then there was a big international study, a fragmentation study by a group called the International Law Commission, who looked at this sort of thing, and they said essentially we should seek to try and harmonise things and integrate rules wherever we can. So that's the second approach that you need to take, to try and harmonise different rules. So that's the answer to the first part of that question, and I probably ought to just pause there before I go on to answer anything more, just in case anybody else wants to say anything on that.
Thanks, Duncan. Clearly, 14 years of your life well spent if you can recite that from the top. Anyone else?
No. Well, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
No. I know that Duncan loves space law, and I'm conscious that we're recording, so I won't talk about the tattoo that you have that says I love space law. But perhaps we can hand over to the other panelists. So in the sense of, are we in the, obviously it's a bit of a lex specialis. We have a specialty body of law here. Clementine might not agree with that, but that's for discussion. Is it lex specialis, the law of space, or IHL itself? And then my follow-up question is what is the really new things about space law? Like, what are the big friction points here? Why is this any different to other areas of IHL, such as the law of naval warfare?
I might take the prerogative to say I don't disagree. That, and as Duncan outlined, it's a question of a rule by rule kind of application of what is the lex specialis for the specific situation, and we could get into the astronauts question is an interesting sort of manifestation of that. I guess for me, I would just say in terms of, I guess, warning against that temptation to consider it's all new and unregulated, and therefore we need to look at totally fresh set of laws, and to say, wait a minute, the Outer Space Treaty reaffirms the application of international law. The ICJ has confirmed that IHL principles apply to all forms of warfare now and into the future. So it's not it's not an unregulated space, but there are challenges to adapt to the specificities of the domain, if you like. And so from a humanitarian perspective, what I would encourage is to be guided by the object and purpose of IHL, which is to limit suffering and preserve human dignity in situations of armed conflict. And if you take that North Star, you can find the application of these rules to the particular domain in a way that respects and protects people. Thank you.
Jens, is there anything you want to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I would, and I think the way Clementine highlighted that was really effective, because I think one of the things that oftentimes I think we struggle is we like to think of law as we want specialized law. And we oftentimes have a kind of knee-jerk reaction of the more specialized the law, the more applicable, but the more fit for purpose, the better designed. But I think, and I go back to that term convergence, we're seeing a range of components, whether it's space activities impacting terrestrial, land navigation, sea navigation, right? That encompasses a range of different areas, practices of law. And so oftentimes we immediately get bogged down and say, oh, well, the law can't respond because we don't have a specialized law for what we're seeing in the environment. But I think to Clementine's point, well, no, you have applicable law. Get back to the purpose, get back to the original object, and work from there to identify the issues, as opposed to always wanting some new piece of law, some new specialized piece of law that you think is going to be this silver bullet to the issue that you're facing.
Giacomo?
Yeah, I would agree with all the points raised by my fellow panelists. In particular, with regard to the lex specialis principle, we do not have to conceive it as a principle that resolves conflicts between legal regimes, but avoids conflicts. So I'm just thinking about the principle of non-harmful interference that in a situation of armed conflict would have to be, I suppose, interpreted in light of the applicable rules of international humanitarian law, those that apply to attacks and military operations. And it's not one legal regime displays another altogether at all times. And secondly, whether space and space law is something completely new, I think it brings us to reflect on how we interpret certain concepts, taking into account the existence of outer space. So in my presentation, in relation to cyber operations, I focused on non-physical harm, but also indirect harm, I think is another big focus, and also the notion of the environment. What about, do we consider the outer space as part of the environment? It's a big issue when we talk about space debris. And if so, how do we inform our legal assessments? Do we apply international environmental law principles to the environment? Do we use those same principles to regulate military operations that may affect the outer space? So I think that an objective and purposes of interpretation of IHL on the one hand and an interpretation by analogy on the other would provide like a lot of answers.
Now we have about 8 minutes left, which by my clock means Duncan's got 7 minutes to talk about neutrality and all things to do with it. Space law. Duncan, the floor is yours. Take it away. Educate us.
So in fact, neutrality is a good example of some of the issues at play and some of the discussion that we've just had. In particular, the problem of domain-specific laws, and so some of the law of neutrality comes from Hague treaties, and I can't remember which particular numbers they are off the top of my head. So that's a failure on my part there. But several of those, well, at least one of those treaties is wholly specific to the maritime domain, and even the one that appears to be more generic is clearly much more applicable in the land domain, and it's difficult to consider how they might apply in the space domain. So what do you do in situations where maybe it appears like there's no particular law? And the reason that this is important in the space domain, and in particular in the context of duality, is because you have commercial entities that are stepping into the shoes of what nations normally do. I mean, we're used to the idea that nations or states, more specifically, states have the monopoly on the use of force, that it's states that use force, it's not commercial entities that use force. And yet, in the space domain, increasingly that is the case, that commercial entities are using force. And I would commend a reference to you if you're trying to think about how this might play out in the future. There's a report by the UK Ministry of Defence called Global Strategic Trends out to 2055. It has a great chapter on space, and it talks about how the space domain is influencing the future geopolitical trends, and vice versa. Future geopolitical trends are influencing the space domain. Companies like SpaceX in particular are having a huge impact on not just the space domain, but on geopolitics generally. And the question is when you've got these commercial entities who are very directly involved in conflict. I mean, Chris had a reference there to use of GPS by drones. There's also been a lot of use of SATCOM by drones, and specifically the Russians were putting Starlink mini terminals on top of their drones until SpaceX as a company whitelisted the Russians who were doing that, and so the Russians couldn't do it anymore. So that was one example of involvement in conflict that was pro-Ukrainian. There was also another example that was kind of pro-Russian in a way, when the Ukrainians wanted to carry out a naval strike, and they were relying on Starlink, and Elon Musk decided that he couldn't support that. It's difficult to believe that was entirely a commercial decision. So it's an instance of a commercial entity getting directly involved in a conflict. And so when you have that sort of situation, there could be circumstances where a commercial entity undermines the neutrality that a state purports to have in respect of a conflict. So in theory, the US is neutral in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. For those who are sort of unfamiliar with the nuance that lawyers sometimes introduce to the situation, they'd probably look at that situation and say, well, gee, it's about as close as you can be to being involved in an armed conflict without actually being involved in an armed conflict. But the nuance that is used in that particular context is that as far as most of the world is concerned, what Russia has done in Ukraine is a violation of international law, and that it therefore doesn't breach the principles of neutrality to support a victim of aggression, of an illegal act. This is the concept of qualified neutrality. And so therefore you have not only the US providing arms to Ukraine, but you have a lot of US companies, particularly space enterprises, who are supporting Ukraine. Now, it works in the context of this concept of qualified neutrality, but it where Russia is said to be doing something that is a violation of international law. In another conflict, that might be a big problem, where you have maybe state A and state B involved in a conflict, and state C doesn't get involved in a conflict, but the companies of state C get involved in the conflict. And the particular problem, as far as space law is concerned, is Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, that says essentially that states are responsible for all of the activities, national activities in outer space. It begs a question, what constitutes national activities in outer space? But potentially you have a situation where a state could find that it's no longer neutral because of the actions of its commercial entity. And the existing laws of neutrality that are somewhat domain specific don't particularly help with that, in part because they are domain specific, and it's hard to just neatly transpose them into the space domain. I don't know if my other panelists want to say anything about that before I take up all of the time.
1 minute. I think we might leave it there, and we can take away, first off, Clementine has put in some links within the chat for ICRC products. I too have put in a flyer for the book itself, and I think we can all walk away knowing that Duncan Blake is space law. And if you have any questions, go directly to him via the satellites. Right. So, but on a more general note, thank you everyone for tonight. We have had 680 make it through to the end of a total of 700. I think that is pretty overwhelming. I've never been on a panel with that many people, and if it was in person, it would have been terrifying. But as it was being online, I think it was much more manageable. So thank you everyone, and we will exit there.
Thank you.